Okay, so I want to talk about Boaz's argument for drug legalization. And I want to be clear how radical Boaz's argument is. Um, Boaz actually will argue that we should legalize all drugs, everything. Not just so-called soft drugs like marijuana or whatever. Boaz would legalize every single drug. In Boaz's world, you could go in the food line and get heroin. Well, maybe not food line. Who knows if food line would carry heroin, but you could go in any store that wanted to carry heroin or meth or what have you and get it. Well, what's Boaz's argument for this? Given how radical his conclusion is, he better have a pretty good one, right? What is it? Well, Boaz actually has three different lines of argument. First of these is just that drug laws don't work. They don't prevent drug use. Second is drug laws do more damage than they prevent. Even if drug laws work, the second one would say, well, they do more harm than good. The final one says that we have a fundamental right to put what we want in our own bodies. Now, Boaz kind of blurs all of these together, and he throws all these arguments out. Boaz's style of argument I would describe as throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and hope some of it sticks. I think it's best, though, that we separate out these arguments, look at each of them individually, say, well, do they work, do they not? So let's go through each of these in turn. We will talk about the first one in this slideshow and get most of the way through the second one. We'll finish the second one in the next one, and we'll save the final one for the next presentation. This is going to take a while, so we'll break it up a bit. So drug laws don't work, argument one. So Boaz will say, if drug laws prevented drug use, alcohol would have went down during Prohibition. So think about Prohibition. Hopefully you guys know we had a massive experiment in the US with making alcohol illegal. The historical stereotype is that this was not a roaring success. The historical stereotype is Prohibition failed miserably, at least as far as actually stopping people from drinking goes. One of our old family stories in my family was actually my grandfather actually made liquor during Prohibition, so it worked out pretty well for Grandpa. He actually did pretty well. But besides making some enterprising fellas like my grandpa better off, we always say he wasn't a gangster, he was a businessman, right? Which I guess is what everybody says. But as far as actually stopping alcohol use goes, the stereotype is Prohibition didn't work, right? So Boaz will say, well, Prohibition doesn't work. Why do we think any other attempt to restrict any other drug will work? Well, let's think about that. This looks like a good argument. I'm not so sure that it is. Well, why not? Well, for one thing, can we generalize from alcohol to all other drugs? Is alcohol different in our culture from other drugs? Is there a reason to think that maybe putting restrictions on alcohol would be harder than putting restrictions on, say, methamphetamine, heroin, or the like? Well, I think there is, right? Think about the role alcohol plays in our culture. I'm going to bet you've been over to a friend's house and he or she said, hey, do you want a beer? Do you want a glass of wine while we watch the game or while we talk about the week? You might go, people even have whole cocktail parties. You might go over and your host or hostess says, hey, do you want a martini? Do you want a Manhattan? That happens pretty commonly, right? Well, what doesn't happen very commonly is you go over to a person's house and they say, oh, would you like some heroin while we watch the game? Or maybe some meth? Now, maybe this does happen, I don't know. But it's not that common, right? It would be pretty remarkable. Well, what this suggests to me is alcohol plays a different role in our culture. It's more central to our culture than are these other drugs. And if alcohol's different, you can't generalize from the failure of prohibition to the failure of drug laws generally. There's one more reason to doubt this too. Well, let me put a pin in that. Now ask yourself, is there a drug that maybe in our culture plays a similar role to alcohol? Think about that for a second. Is there a drug that might play a similar role? Well, I would argue that marijuana does, right? Lots of people hang out socially, they do marijuana. Look, I hesitate to make these points because I feel like everybody thinks I probably have a bong in my living room when I say this sort of stuff. I don't, but it is a fact. Marijuana plays a social role that most drugs don't. So if this argument works, it might be a good argument for legalizing marijuana, since marijuana is similar to alcohol in the role it plays in our culture. It's not a good argument for legalizing all drugs. Now, one other reason to be very skeptical of this argument, I'm not sure it works at all. Premise 2 says alcohol use did not go down during the Prohibition, and that is the historical stereotype. The problem is it might not be true. There is some evidence, some pretty good evidence, that alcohol use actually went down during Prohibition. Admissions to state mental institutions for alcohol psychosis fell pretty sharply at the beginning of Prohibition. They went back up as Prohibition went along, but by the end of Prohibition, enforcement was very, very lax. They weren't even really trying that hard anymore. Secondly, deaths because of cirrhosis of the liver also went down very sharply during Prohibition. Well, cirrhosis of the liver is caused almost entirely by alcohol abuse. So if Prohibition didn't work, if it didn't prevent alcohol use, well, how do you explain that? So I don't think we should grant premise 1, and I think Boaz needs a lot more proof for premise 2 beyond simply resting with a historical stereotype that very well might not be true. Okay, so Boaz has another similar argument, based on experience with drug laws that he thinks suggest or show that drug laws don't work. And so this second argument hinges on the fact that heavier enforcement of drug laws doesn't seem to decrease drug use. And Boaz is actually right about this. Heavier enforcement for, say, laws against cocaine and heroin don't really lead to decreases in use, as far as we can tell. Again, it's hard to know exactly how much drugs people do. For obvious reasons, people might not be open, but as far as we can tell, heavier enforcement does not do a whole lot to decrease use. Okay, so let's look at Boaz's argument. If laws against drug use prevented drug use, more enforcement of drug laws would decrease drug use. We throw more resources at it, we put more cops on the street looking for cocaine or heroin or whatever drug, and we give drug dealers and drug users longer sentences maybe. That seems like it's going to decrease drug use. Cocaine and heroin use do not fall when we have more enforcement of those laws. Again, this is true, right? We threw a lot of resources at cocaine in the 80s. We upped penalties for dealers. We put a lot of cops whose main job was to go after cocaine. As far as we can tell, did very little, if anything, to decrease cocaine use. So heavier enforcement for drug laws do not decrease drug use, so laws against drug use do not prevent drug use. So this looks like a good argument. This looks like, and I think this is a better argument than the first one. There's still a problem with it. I'm not sure it's entirely convincing. Well, what's wrong with it? Well, the problem with this argument is probably premise one. Now, it looks true, but as a matter of fact, it might not be. The research I've done on drug laws and how they prevent drug use say that they prevent drug use by two ways. The first way is that simply by making a drug illegal, you create a social stigma, you create a sort of bad reputation for doing that drug. Well, if that's the case, a lot of people are not going to do that drug. Well, that seems pretty independent of the level of enforcement, this social stigma aspect, right? Well, what's the second way that making a drug illegal prevents drug use? Well, the second way is that simply by making a drug illegal, you drive up the cost. It's way more expensive than it would be if it were legal. Well, the problem here is that simply by making a drug illegal, you drive up the cost a whole lot. Simply by making it illegal and having just even a little bit of enforcement, just arresting the most open, blatant drug dealers, you drive up the price a lot from what the drug would be if it were legal. Here's the thing though, heavier enforcement, be it more cops on the street, be it heavier penalties, don't seem to do that much to drive up costs beyond what just making the drug illegal does. Hard to know what the drugs would cost if they were legal. Consensus is that it probably doubles or triples the price, maybe more, depending on the drug. Well, what does heavier enforcement do? Heavier enforcement with cocaine in the 80s, the evidence is that it drove up the cost by about 15%. Think of something you like. Whether it's beer, whether it's coffee, whether it's sugary snacks. Now, how would your behavior change if the price of this thing you like tripled or even doubled? I bet you would do a lot less of it. I like coffee a lot. I am drinking coffee while I give this lecture. If the price of coffee tripled, I would notice that. I would drink less coffee. As much as I like coffee, there are other things I want to spend my money on. Well, now imagine the price of something you like went up 15%. If you're a really savvy penny-pinching consumer, you might notice that. My wife would notice that. Well, but a lot of you might not even notice it. I certainly wouldn't notice if the price of coffee went up 15%. And even if you noticed and you grumbled, would that 15% be enough to make you do a lot less of it? Well, probably not. So I think Boaz may have shown with this argument that maybe heavy enforcement of drug laws doesn't do what we'd want it to do. Maybe that's a waste of resources. Maybe we should rethink how much resources we put into enforcing drug laws. I would tend to agree with Boaz. Has he shown we should legalize drugs? No, I don't think he has. All right. So that leaves Boaz's final argument, or the second argument, with drug laws do more harm than good. Well, before giving that argument, I think we ought to ask ourselves, how exactly do drug laws do harm? Well, Boaz cites a few ways, and I think three of these ways, I'm not convinced by all of them, but I think at least three of these ways he's right. He is right in suggesting and thinking that drug laws create some harms that wouldn't exist otherwise. So the first of these is that making drugs illegal causes violence. How does it do this? Well, remember what I said about the duty to obey the law and how great it was to have the law. One reason it's great to have a legal system is it gives us a non-violent way to settle disputes. If your neighbor keeps trespassing on your land, if he keeps, even if, y'all don't agree on the property line or whatever, well, you're going to end up in court, right? It's not going to be the case that you guys both get guns and shoot it out. At least not probably. You're going to court. If Google thinks that Apple or Microsoft is stealing some of its intellectual property, well, it's not that they're going to hire a bunch of private goons to go break into Microsoft Office or teach them a lesson. What are they going to do? They're going to go to court. Well, drug dealers have disputes. They're businessmen. They have disputes like any other businessman, but they can't go to court. One drug dealer thinks the other one's taking his territory. Well, he can't go to court. They can't settle it that way. How can they settle disputes? Only way is through violence. Second harm that drug laws do is they contribute at least to mass incarceration. Now, there's a huge argument how much they do so, but I think they do so to some extent. That's pretty much beyond argument. Mass incarceration being that we have a lot of people in jail in this country, a lot more than just about any other country. Well, and that's probably a bad thing, right? Mass incarceration, it's bad in three ways, right? One, you're hurting the people you put in jail. They don't want to be in jail. Two, you're wasting social resources keeping them in jail. And three, you're harming their families and communities by taking them away, right? So if we don't need to put people in jail, if we have more people in jail than we should, that's a bad thing. And there's pretty good evidence that at least one of the reasons we have so many people in jail is because of our drug laws. And a lot of the people we have in jail for drug laws are not particularly violent. They were just selling drugs. Finally, drug laws do harm by leading to violations of other rights. Boaz, he's overstating his case by saying free America or drug-free America, but he thinks that drug laws threaten our freedom, and I'm inclined to agree with him. We have all kinds of searches and seizures, searching people's cars, searching their houses, looking for drugs, right? There's other laws that are less noticed, but no less terrible. It is very, very easy for law enforcement to seize your property just on mere suspicion of some kind of involvement with drugs. It's very easy for them to seize it. It is very hard for you to get it back. This has led to some pretty terrible cases, especially if you are taking any amount of cash over international borders. It's very easy for the government to say, well, we think he's using it for drugs, we're going to take it. And if the government does that, they can seize it without any proof. You are pretty much guilty until proven innocent as far as getting that money back goes. You have to prove that it was not going to drugs or some other illegal purpose. You have to prove that you had a legitimate purpose for it. There was a recent case where a man was taking his life savings to Albania. He was Albanian. He was taking it back to his family. Well, Albania doesn't have a functioning bank system. That's why he was taking cash. Government seized his life savings. They have yet to give it back. He's having to spend tens of thousands of dollars, which will, even if he gets it back, mostly exhaust his life savings. These sorts of laws are justified in terms of the war on drugs. So I tend to agree with Boaz on all this. I think our current drug laws do more harm than good. So that's his argument for legalization. We should either keep current drug laws or entirely legalize drugs. Current drug laws do more harm than good, so we should not keep current drug laws, so we should entirely legalize drugs. Well, now think back to earlier in the semester, think back to the fallacies we looked at. Ask yourself, does this argument maybe commit one of them? Take a few minutes between this lecture and the next. Ask yourself, is there a fallacy here, and what is it? There is. I'll give you guys a hint. Think about what it might be.